comfortable chair in the house, so I'm trying to not fall asleep on having this conversation. Because I can talk about food for a very, very long time. I have an attention span that's short for my ability to talk about it. Yeah, can everybody hear me?
No.
All right. No? We're good? Just out of curiosity, how many people here are from the food world? You're coming at it as chefs or as restaurateurs or have come about the creation of food. Yeah? I can see a chef and chef's wife, so that's a dead giveaway. And how about people from the art world? The people here who are approaching food as an artistic material? One person in the back. So who are the rest of you? Couple more. All right. So a few thank yous. First of all, I would like to thank Cervantes, who's been instrumental in my research, who living in Delhi when I was trying to find people to connect with in Spain, I got in contact with Jesus, and she very graciously supported me and helped me to find my way. That was very instrumental in my research in San Sebastian, which was an exceptional experience for me. Also to Shura, who I've respected your work for a very long time, and for me to sit here and have a conversation with you about a subject that's very dear to my heart is a great privilege. Not only that, it's also exciting for me to see this development of the material of food as it moves into the art world, as it starts to gain respect by serious people. To be able to have this conversation is very exciting. It's a sort of realization of an ambition for me. And finally, to Coach, I was a part of the In Context Food Edition 3 residency a couple of years ago. And it was a great experience for me, and to be able to come back for the Food Edition 3 is also been a super experience. And so I went to see it a couple of weeks ago, and it's just a privilege to be here. I'm going to talk about conceptual gastronomy, which may be a new term to a lot of people. Maybe I made it up, I'm not sure. I'm sure somebody else must be using it as well. And what is it? So conceptual gastronomy is a branch of molecular gastronomy that deals specifically with communicating concepts through the material of molecular gastronomy. So where molecular gastronomy is concerned with the dining experience, with the sort of dining play, conceptual gastronomy is also about using that material to communicate certain ideas, concepts. I will be talking about art in the European context for this discussion. That's important to say because there's sort of different rules that apply to European art than other places. And most of the food that I'll be discussing is actually about Spanish gastronomy. Part of that is because a lot of the research that I've done is in Spain, but also because Spain has really led the world in this sort of gastronomy, and it remains the most respected country in the world. Collectively, for all of the restaurants, the Michelin stars combined are enough to create a global constellation. So, finally, I'm going to be taking a curatorial approach. And what I mean by that is that as a person who's studying curatorial practice, I'm not going to be approaching gastronomy from the perspective of an artist, of the creator of the food. What I am going to be doing is talking about food from a curatorial perspective. That's a caretaker. A collector, a person who cares about the ideas and the way that those ideas are conveyed, organized and represented. And so that has an influence on the way that I'll be talking. All right. Food has been a subject in art since the beginning of art. Some of the first ideas that were painted on the walls of the insides of caves were about hunting, they're about cooking. Building a fire together and sharing a meal. And from that time, food has remained a constant theme inside of visual art. But it's only been relatively recently that the actual material of food has started to become used in art practice. We can trace its roots back to perhaps the symbolists, certainly the futurists, Marinetti's play with food. And then from there into conceptual art, you start to see this material of food playing an increasing role. Here we have Yoko Ono, who is showing us the most basic material of food, the apple, which is both aesthetic as well as important, certainly in the European tradition, the symbolism of the apple. John Baldessari He's an artist, he's a conceptual artist, and he was doing artwork for some time. And you can see on his placard, he says, from 1953 to 1966. This piece is called The Cremation Project, and what he decided is that actually the work that he had done during that period wasn't the work that he was supposed to do. He discovered conceptual art, and he took that art that he'd done before, and he actually burned it. And from the ashes of his burned artwork, his body of artwork, he baked cookies. And he placed those cookies inside of an urn with a sort of epitaph that listed all of the artworks that he had done prior to that, as well as the recipe for the cookies that he had baked. So this is another example of food in conceptual art, but what's important for me is actually what he said recently, and in fact this week in The Guardian during an interview, he said the best thing a curator can do is elicit the response, "I did not know that you could do that," from the public. And what I hope that I can do today in this talk is actually elicit that response from you, is, "I didn't know that you could do that." So this is the aim of my talk. You can tell me at the end if I've been successful. Molecular gastronomy started in earnest at the beginning of the 90s. It started with the emergent, or with the connection of science and gastronomy. And it started in particular with a chef, Ranadria, who was classically trained in both French and Spanish cuisine. This is important because even as he plays with food, with the material of food, there's a strong connection to traditional recipes. And that, in some way, validates it both inside of the art world and inside of the food world. But what happened is that him, along with several other people, but Herf Thies was certainly important as a scientist, Hessen Blumenthal was already on the stage at this point, that they started to deconstruct food to a molecular level, and then reconstruct it, as you mentioned, back into a different form. And often into a form that represented something that didn't look like food at all. And from this early starting place came a sort of lexicon, a new material to play with in an artistic way, in a very creative way, opening possibilities that didn't exist prior to this. This is virgin olive oil, caramel, spring. And it was placed inside of a jewelry box on a bed of rock salt. And it was served towards the end of a meal of one of many dishes. And the idea was to play with this boundary between what we understand as food and what we understand as art. What we understand as jewelry, even in this sense, and design, and what we can eat. And this opened the door to an international movement that is still thriving and continues to develop, to pick up steam today. But as dumb as it's, what I would like to do in this talk is give you a new way of considering this sort of food. I know that molecular gastronomy has made some inroads into India, but I would like to kind of give a new paradigm, a new way of considering it. That is that most food appeases the senses, and it appeases the appetite. It's a sort of combination of nutritional necessity, sensual intoxication, and social interaction. But what this sort of food is about is something different. It's about an exploration of the mind. It's playing with things like surprise and pleasure and intrigue. Normally in a meal like this, you would have a tasting menu of between 15 and 30 different dishes. And each one would be a different representation of food, a different idea, a different way of dining. And along with that, very often it's paired with spirits, which is an important component to this exploration. This is another piece from Al-Buli, and it's called Peach Paper. And knowing the food of Al-Buli, you would have to believe that it tasted even better than it looked, that it would taste as an exquisite peach, because he aims towards a certain perfection in his food. But we have to be careful is that just because there's culinary wizardry and a sort of certain aesthetic doesn't necessarily make it art. It's not to take anything away from gastronomy. It's actually to validate gastronomy as its own distinct cultural expression. But it's to also recognize that there's a difference between gastronomic practice and art practice, between the aims of gastronomy and the aims of art. But what you see in this work is you see a new material that has the potential to communicate in the language of art. I'd like to very briefly just cover some sensory science. It's going to help us to understand a little bit more about what I'm talking about. So first of all, the way that we taste is divided into three senses. We call them collectively the chemical senses. the first thing that happens when you put something into your mouth is an experience of touch, temperature. This is called mouthfeel, or kinesthesis. Along with that, you have the chemical reaction of the food molecules against your skin. So things like carbonation, menthol, piquant, spiciness. This is actual chemical reaction on your skin. Second of all, you have your tongue, which tastes sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. And so these flavors, when they're processed by your tongue, are processed biologically. They pass first into your body, then your body sends those signals to your brain, and then afterwards they're processed cognitively. Finally, we have flavor. And flavor is actually the process of olfaction. So when you chew on something, you're breaking up the molecules, and those molecules are being passed retronasally, that means through the back of your throat, to your olfactory receptors. These are the same receptors that we use when we smell something. And so the act of eating a flavor, enjoying a flavor, and the act of smelling is essentially the same thing. These processors, these receptors, send this information to our olfactory lobe, where they're directly wired into our cortex. And so they trigger not only our memory of all of the flavors that we've had similar or different to that experience, but they also are a direct line to the emotions and the memories that are associated with those flavors. And so for me, this is a very important dimension of flavor and of taste. And so when I talk, I'll often refer to the chemical senses as opposed to what's commonly understood as the sense of taste. Some of the work that I've done has been about clearing away some of the obstacles that the traditional or conventional art world has had with dealing with the chemical senses. First of all is that we have a long tradition of art theory. And throughout this history of art theory, the greatest minds in philosophy, of cognitive studies, of natural science have told us again and again, first of all, that these senses are no longer important to us as humans. And second of all, that they don't have a place in art. And I take issue with that. I think that, first of all, these senses are important to our world, to our exploration of the world. It begs the question, what is art? And so I would propose an understanding of art that, at least in conceptual art, it's about the communication of concepts using symbols in a material form. It's a sort of philosophical language that we use. It's a physical language that we use to communicate through form, through matter. And if the purpose of this philosophy is to explore the human condition, the world that exists around us, then we'd have to say, as human beings that have a complete sensorium, that have the sense of taste and smell and sight and touch and sound, hearing, we should have artwork that represents all of those senses. And so a lot of my work has been about addressing these traditional arguments that have excluded the sense of taste and smell from art practice and saying that we need to have an arts expression that tells us about our whole human experience. And we need to create new theory in order to do that. So one of the first obstacles is about encountering old ideas about the senses in art. The second is a question of intentionality. And so what intentionality is that if you'd like to participate in this philosophical language, this conversation of art, what we need to do is we need to intend an object to be art. That means that you need to assert yourself into the conversation. It's helpful in art terms. And so what we have here is we have two different pieces. First of all, we have Marcel Duchamp's famous piece, The Fountain, which was essentially a urinal that he had taken that was not intended as art, and it was placed inside of an art gallery and said, now it's art, talk about it. And this created a lot of controversy inside of the art world. And it arrived at the conclusion that actually, if it's intended as art, then it can be considered as art because it might have something interesting to say about the world that we live in. But on the other side, what we have is this fantastic dish by Azurmendi, and what it is it's the memory of an experience. It's the memory of the chef's experience of the Spanish seaside. From his childhood, and he wanted to share this experience with people. And so you can see in the design of the plate, you have the light reflected off of the surface of the water. You have the mist in the early morning of the seaside as it floats over the surface. And this mist actually is not as simple as just boiling seawater. It had to be created using techniques that are familiar to perfume. And then beyond that, you have the taste and the smell of the ocean that's represented here, given to you in the form of an oyster. And so together, this dish is multisensory. It communicates a sort of memory, a certain concept. But the problem that I have with it is that it was never intended as art. It was never placed into the conversation of art and said, what do you think about this? How does this, what does this have to say about the world that we live in, about our senses, about our memories, about place? And I think that if it had taken that extra step, then it would be very easy to consider it as art. But at the moment, most of the gastronomy that is developed in the vein of molecular gastronomy is not intended for that purpose. We await the symbolism of taste and smell. So the visual language of art has many centuries behind it. We have symbols that are created, passed on from the beginning of art through the Renaissance, through symbolist movement, which is the whole movement about codifying visual symbols into things with meaning. But we've never passed through the similar kind of process in the language of taste and smell. And so the question is, can we? Do flavors and do fragrances, can they possess meaning? Can they transfer meaning from me to you? I believe that they can, and from my experience and my research, I believe they can. But the problem that we have is that this language is underdeveloped. And so the semantic language of taste and flavor, although it has this potential, hasn't been utilized. And I think that it has certainly a lot of scope to do that, but we have to ask the question, are we willing to learn a new language of flavor just in order to have a sort of conceptual food? Or can we also use the symbols, the visual symbols that are presented to us in visual art, and use this added dimension of taste and smell to draw on emotions and to draw on an experience? And I think that that might be the better way to go forward. An additional issue is a question of pedagogy. That is the sort of training that we receive in our disciplines in order to produce the ideal, in this case, artist, chef, scientist. So here we have Joseph Beuys, for me is a sort of hero of art, Fecha, which is my hero of gastronomy, and Nikola Tesla, who I adore in science. What these three people represent is a very specific sort of training with very specific sort of aims. And so the artist, the aim is to communicate in this philosophical language, material language. The chef, his aim is to create something that tastes delicious. Deliciousness is not only a physical imperative, but it's also a gastronomic ideal. And so when we create dishes, it's about creating something that is the ideal of deliciousness for the context that we live in. So what's delicious in one place is maybe not always delicious in another. And the scientist, it's about the pursuit of knowledge. It's about understanding the truths of the universe. And so we have these three different aims and these three different disciplines, and we live in a time of convergence. And so where science and gastronomy have come together to produce molecular gastronomy has been the outcome of that. On the side of gastronomy and art, we don't have a lot of collaboration in the sense of molecular gastronomy and art. I have to qualify that. And so I spent some time in the Basque Culinary Center, which has incredible facilities for science and for art. And they have cognitive studies laboratories and biochemistry laboratories and molecular gastronomy laboratories. And I said, we need to get more art happening in here. What about design? What about performance? What about theater? This needs to happen in here as well. We got really excited about talking about those possibilities as well. And so this becomes a problem at an institutional level, is that if we want to create chefs that are producing gastronomy that is considered an art, we need to be able to understand each other. And that comes down to education and institution. So what do we have so far? We have a lot of possibilities at this point. Molecular gastronomy is a relatively young expression. And so if we look at this dish by Arzac called Fractiles, it's basically, it's placed, the dish is mead, so it's like a honey wine, and I believe it's blood orange that's placed into it. And you get this superposition of the two liquids by superheating one and chilling the other. When the two come together, they create a fractile. This is a long ways away from where molecular gastronomy started. We started off with foams and spherification, some liquid nitrogen, and now what's happened is that this repertoire is steadily increasing. The whole world is exploring new ways to play with this material of food at a very molecular, scientific, basic level, and with it, it's transforming the possibilities. And so we're building a sort of toolbox of these materials. You see in this next dish by Arzak called Moon Rocks, this is chocolate-coated pebbles of freeze-dried orange and Cointreau, and it's on gray sand of powdered black and white sesame seeds. And so you see new materials. And what you see in this is you see the potential. You see the potential to start to use this material to convey concepts. Right now it's mostly being used, and even in Arzak, when I was talking to the research and development chef, he said it's about having fun, it's about exploring, it's about play with our clientele, with our customers. It's a sort of circus of food. Not in a bad way, a detrimental way at all, but in a very enthusiastic, playful, fun way. And this is very much in the spirit of the region, I would say. But the possibilities are there for more. Again, with Arzak, this dish of petit fours, you can see how sculpture plays a role in this, and how sculpture is actually increasingly important with new tools like 3D printing. The possibilities are unleashed. And I have to mention in this dish by El Celler de Candroca as one example, here you see a bread plate. The plate is not actually made, it's not spray painted bread, it's actually cast bread cast in aluminum. But the partner of design, as a material designer, working in collaboration with a chef has become a new reality. It's become very important for this sort of food. And what you find is that where the designer creates a stage and the gastronomer create the food, together the total is greater than the sum of the parts. And this collaboration is very, very exciting, and it's happening all around the world. I've had the privilege of working with a few designers and gastronomers together. So to wrap this up, I think what I want to show you is a few examples of concepts. Concepts that are realized in food. For me, one of the most exciting places to have researched was in Lugar. Lugar is a place that has done away with the imperative of deliciousness as the ultimate ideal in gastronomy. And they say, okay, deliciousness, yes, but concept is also important. And sometimes, in very special cases, we're willing to break the rules of deliciousness in order to communicate a concept. They don't even see themselves as a restaurant. They see themselves as a sensorium. And they see themselves inside of the sensorium as storytellers, people that are conveying narratives. And so this is all very exciting, but they're so far ahead is that the clientele and the customers sometimes have a hard time keeping up with this narrative. And so when I was there, it was such a privilege to be able to explore these dishes together and to experience them. So you start off a dish with stones. At least in Europe, but I imagine that in any culture, if you were served a stone as part of your meal, it would be a sort of slight. It's a faux pas. And yet, here the first thing that you're confronted with is a stone. Something that we understand as being the essence of inedibility. And so if someone is starving, they're confronted with a stone in your belly. I have a stone in your belly, you're hungry. And here these stones are delicious. They're succulent roasted potatoes that appear to be stones. So this is a very simple concept, but I think that it's a good starting point. This next dish, again by Bugarets, they decided to make a representation of the 7 deadly sins, which again in European culture is a rather important idea for society, in that it somehow affects our history of who we are as a society as a whole. And so they wanted to convey each of the deadly sins in dishes, and this was the dish that they used to represent vanity. So they took the idea of vanity as being a thing of beauty, a representation of beauty, a self-indulgent beauty, and they used bubbles in order to convey the idea of emptiness, that inside this beauty is essentially an empty core. And what they found actually, they intuitively stumbled into this idea of using bubbles to represent vanity, but they had a researcher that came along and was working with them and said, actually it's interesting that you chose bubbles to represent vanity because all through the history of visual art, bubbles have been used to represent vanity. And so intuitively they had arrived at the same conclusion of many people before them, that bubbles represent vanity. So there's a sort of semantic language that they stumbled into. This was the final dish. And here you find representation of each of the 7 deadly sins. So greed is simply represented as an old antique coin. Avarice was a dish that was piquant, was spicy, but also delicious, something that you wanted to have more of. Lust was something that you just couldn't get enough of. It was a sweet flavor that rolled around and stayed with you inside of your mouth. Even the dish that it came in was soft and malleable. Envy, something that you can't have, but you wish was there. Gluttony, these were actually corn crisps, I guess, wrapped in chocolate. The idea that you just can't get enough and you want to, once you start, you just eat more and more. Sloth was something that you chewed on, and as you tried to chew on it, just stuck in your mouth. It became gummy and gooey, and you just couldn't really ever get it out of your mouth, and you couldn't swallow it. And finally, the final representation of vanity, which was a mirrored box, so as you looked into it, you see a reflection of yourself, and you see a thing of beauty. And again, inside of that chocolate that was painted gold was essentially an empty coin. I'll finish with this final dish, which for me was the most interesting one. This was a dish of turbot, of baby turbot. And I think that this represents 2 things. First, it's a very good illustration of conceptual gastronomy. But secondly, it's also expresses a need for a new sort of food critic. The food critic that we have is a critic that comes and assesses a dish based on the qualities of taste. It's very much like the Enlightenment art critic that we had, where they would say that it's either good art or it's bad art. It's good food or it's bad food. It's subjective. It's a subjective judgment. It's economic. But this dish will tell you, when I explain what it is, will explain to you why we need a new sort of food critic. Because if you approach this dish based on what does this baby turbot taste like, you're going to completely miss the point. This dish is actually about genetic selection. It's about our human relationship with nature. Since medieval times, pre-human times, we have this relationship with nature where we would go to the sea to fish, to collect something that we needed to survive. We knew not to take the baby fish, because if we eat all the baby fish, then there's no grown-up fish later. So we would throw them back into the sea, and we just take the large fish and cook them and eat them. Eventually, this idea of casting back the small fish became codified in law. It became illegal. It's now illegal to fish for baby fish. But when Lugar said that they wanted to create a dish that was based on turbot, the fish farm, or the supplier of their fish nearby, said, we can make that dish for you. We can even give you baby turbot. And so suddenly there's this question, wait a sec, baby turbot. There's no longer this problem of supply and demand. There's endless supply. Our relationship with nature has fundamentally changed. We can eat as many baby turbot as we want to without risking this collapse of the food system. I mean, it's not to argue the ethics of it, but it's simply to point out that there's an ethical change here. There's a difference in our relationship with nature that's happened, that's not being explored yet. And so the dish is called suspicious. First of all, it's suspicious because you're eating a whole baby turbot, which is about the size of a goldfish in its entirety. It's also suspicious because it talks about our changing relationship with nature and the fact that there's not a lot of discussion that's happening with this about our changing interactions and about what that means for our changing society. So what I would like to do now is I would like to invite Shuda up to give us his thoughts and to share some questions, and then we'll start to have some discussion.
Hello, everyone. Well, let me first of all thank you, Ryan, for this wonderful journey through all sorts of senses and through the Cervantes Institute to code that I'm very curious to see what the results of residency are. I feel very unqualified to have this conversation on that, and I will start off with that confession because I can't cook to save my life. I need rules and all that. But as being part of the Raqs Media Collective, one of my colleagues, who is not here, is a fantastic cook. We have often joked about the fact that we have another line of business. And having been reviewed in the New York Times, both in the arts as well as in the cooking section, because once Sudesh offered a recipe for an art restaurant, I can tell you that we were much happier with the with the review in the cooking section. That, by way of preface. I've had a few thoughts while having these conversations with you, both earlier and today, and I'd like to share them because I think that they touch to the very root of the question of how do we actually perceive and understand the world. To some extent, John Baldessari's question, I didn't know you could do that, is what I'm talking about. And whenever you look at the Adam and Eve paintings, whether it's Dürer or anybody else, any image of Adam and Eve in the apple, I think Adam's asking Eve, I didn't know you could do that. And that's pretty essential because the apple, the fruit, is the fruit of knowledge. That's where knowledge comes from. Knowledge comes from that ingestion. And that's the experience that was sought to be avoided. We were sought to be living in a world in which you didn't need to eat. Right? But the fact that once you need to eat, you also need to know what you're going to eat. Because understanding what you're going to eat is going to be pretty crucial if you're not going to die. Because food is both nourishment and poison. What you put inside your system can kill you and can make you live longer and better. So knowledge, I think, and an apprehension of the world out of knowledge is fundamentally based on a gastronomical experience of some sort. And for me, therefore, it's not at all accidental that philosophy begins with food rather than the other way around. Philosophy has to be, first of all, about what do we eat, what can kill us, what is poison, what is nourishment. It's customary today, I suppose, in this evening to invoke Cervantes. I'm quite happy to do that. And I mean not the Institute, only the writer. Because Cervantes in Don Quixote gave us one of the most profound literary experiences of eating and feasting, which have to do with the contrast of Quixote's frugality and Sancho Panza's appetite. And it's dramatized, for instance, in a beautiful episode called The Wedding of Connaught. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly because I only read it in English translation. And this wedding feast, this banquet, which is a backdrop to a complicated conversation on what is true love. And you realize that throughout the history of the human species, conversations and important things have always had to be undercut by some amount of nourishment, food or drink. So Plato's symposium is actually a banquet. The Rig Vedic hymns are all about feeding the gods. They're about creating the burnt offerings that you produce for other people, and what you get left behind is the leftovers. So the entire field of theological speculation is about what is offering and what is residue in culinary senses. So let's come back to Cervantes and Connaught's feast. It's a trope of excess. I mean, there is a massive spit of meat roasting, within which there are 12 suckling pigs, within which there are geese and ducks, within which there are pheasants. So it's like this kind of complicated labyrinth of food. And there's balefuls of spices, and there's barrelfuls of olive oil and wine and all sorts of excess. But I think what's interesting is not the description of the excess. Descriptions of gastronomical excess are rare in literature, are rare in pre-modern literature, primarily because there were not available experiences. People didn't have that much to eat. So that when they were eating in large quantities, they tended to be fantastical and mythical experiences. A description of a barbecue that Achilles does in Iliad for some of the other heroes. There's one description of a feast by a sage called Bharadwaj for Ram's brother Bharat in the Ramayana, where there's a lot of eating. And there's a hungry god who eats up everything when the Pandavas set fire to a forest in the Mahabharata. That's it. There's not much other eating. There's gestures towards eating. People say, oh, they ate well. They were fed well. Food and wine flow.
never accurate descriptions. When we come to the question of accurate descriptions, we know that there are people attending to something, and they're talking about more than the description. Through the enlistment, through the catalogue of experiences and olfactory and sensory experiences, they're pointing to this question of what Baldessari said. I didn't know you could do that. That knowledge has to do with the fact that the tongue is actually a continent of taste receptors. We know that the taste receptors in the tongue are distributed in all sorts of interesting ways. And I found your little elaboration of the chemical senses really useful in this regard, because they are, in a sense, the first senses. Remember that for 9 months, the only distinctions we enjoy in the first 9 months of existence are more or less the chemical ones. They're olfactory, they're to do with taste. The developing embryo's sense of vision is pretty limited. There isn't much to see. The sense of hearing is muted because there isn't that much to hear when it comes to a solid wall. But there's ingestion all the time, right? And in these descriptions, in these catalogues of things that we eat and things that we don't eat, the specialness of what mothers feed on when they're pregnant has to do with the fact that they're feeding for the future. They're feeding to create and sustain new life. Which means knowledge is absolutely essential to the act of feeding. And there cannot be a knowledge without foraging, without feeding, without eating, without sharing food. And these descriptions of culinary excess, for me, stand as allegories for what we must know in order to live well. And that's why I think, contrary to all the ways in which the philosophers that you list from Heidegger to Kant, who diss the senses of food and smell, my suspicion is that they're dismissing them not because they don't think they're important, but they think that because they know that these are really tremendously serious matters, and that they do not have the conceptual apparatus as yet to be able to actually deal with what is so elemental to us. Because as we were talking about just a little while ago, if we see the difference we span from being a single-celled organism, which is what we all begin as, more or less, to a full-grown adult, you actually increase in size about 120 billion times. That's the how much we expand. And all that expansion comes from outside. It doesn't come from within us. It cannot happen if there is no ingestion, if there is no transformation of energy, of carbohydrates, proteins, minerals, and vitamins into sugars, into sources of energy. That source of energy is what produces the human body. So the ability to feed, the ability to forage, the ability to actually sustain and nourish oneself is so fundamental to human life that I don't think that you can have a philosophical sort of structure or an understanding of either knowledge or aesthetics without an understanding or an innate understanding of food. You invoked Kant, and we talked about this briefly. Kant has a sweet little essay, and I use the word sweet earlier, because actually, unlike, I would beg to differ a little bit from you, because the culinary metaphors are, I think, fundamental to our understanding of all sorts of distinction. We can talk about bitter philosophy, or a sweet understanding of music, or a painting, or an image that strikes us as pungent. We can do these things because the senses of taste, I think, are actually the foundational tastes. All other distinctions. And it's not accidental that the tongue is both the sense organ of taste as well as speech. Because think back to some primordial moment where the sounds of exclamation when the tongue encountered something sharp for the first time may have been very different from the sounds of comfort when the tongue encountered something soft and sweet on the other. And perhaps it was the sensory distinction of that sharp sound and the soft sound, that sound of relief and that sound of pain, that may lie at the beginnings of what we can understand as the apparatus of language. So in that sense, the tongue itself, as the organ of speech, and as the organ of taste, and as the organ of distinction, produces the experiences necessary for us to know that one thing is one thing and another thing is another thing. Think of the tongue as the thing that said to the body, I didn't know you could do that. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that we are at the moment right now in the arts where, having liberated ourselves from our servitude to concepts and objects alone, we are returning at some fundamental level to art and art making as the crux of a conversation that is philosophical and nourished at the same time. That is about experience. And I know we talked a little bit about this. What I'm proposing, before we open up this question to discussion, what I'm proposing is very simply this. Eating and experiencing the world in terms of food is fundamentally about transforming something from form to formlessness to other kinds of form. If you hunt an animal, butcher it, cook it, and then eat it, and then excrete it, and use what is left for your nourishment, you're actually undertaking an adventure of forms of different kinds. Forms have to be broken down, reconstituted, broken down, reconstituted, and broken down again. And the key interesting thing over here is the fact that what you experience and apprehend is also what becomes a part of you. The food that you eat becomes who you are. It produces you the next day. If you stopped eating food for a few days, there would be no you to success, right? And occasionally the food that you eat will also kill you. Eventually the food that you eat will definitely kill you, right? So this delicate balance between what we eat, who we become, and what becomes of us, what we ingest, what happens to us in the ingestion, and what we become as a result of ingestion, is for me the fundamental understanding of what happens when we encounter an art. We no longer have to deal in the world of aesthetics, thankfully, with the idea that an artwork or an object refers to some abstract eternal entity that lives above, beyond, and far away from us in some abstract universe decreed by Plato. We now live in a world where the relationship between the arts and us is far more neurological, far more corporeal, far more contingent in terms of the way in which we think about memory, experience, and our drives and our pleasures. Which is why it's 100 years since Marcel Proust wrote Remembrance of Things Past, and we know that happens only because he dips the Madeleine in a cup of tea, and the aroma and the taste and the olfactory sensation takes him back to that experience of memory. Like you said, like the chef who produces that work, which is all about the experience of memory of the seaside. So, without attending to what is nourishment and poison in what we take in our bodies and our systems, I think today we can no longer talk about art. So the question for me is not just about what we as artists, as curators, as writers, as connoisseurs of the arts can learn. It's not just about what the world of gastronomy can learn from art. It's also the question of what the world of art making can learn from gastronomy. Learn from gastronomy not in terms of the surface questions of texture and taste and presentation, but in terms of what I think are the core philosophical questions of what it means to be nourished and to be nourishing, to create a climate in which we can grow healthy and be prepared to share things with each other. Because food is all about sharing, eating together, sharing an experience together, remembering a taste together, and anticipating future possibilities. And that's why I think it's very exciting that Coach is doing this residency for the third time, that you are presenting this, and that I have an opportunity in this. Thank you.